So welcome to all of those who've joined us already. I'm Stéphane Bourgeois. I've been responsible for European relations and policies at the Negawatt Association for almost 3 years now, after a dozen of years in Morocco and in Brussels, particularly working on climate and energy policies. Negawatt is a think tank mostly known for its energy and climate scenarios in France. And we're coordinating this clever project, which is the topic of the day. Clever for collaborative low energy vision for the European region. This has been a long but exciting project involving the work of around 25 partners and many more experts all around Europe for the past 3 years. So we're very moved to show you first results today. And I'd like to insist on this. Today is a session where we would like to show you first preliminary results. It's not a launch. The launch will come next year. What we'll be showing you is still in draft format, but we really wanted to exchange with you today, as we'll be very grateful for your feedback in order to be able to publish next year. Most of the experts I've talked about are with us and have a panelist function today. So I'll just first seconds sharing my screen. I hope this will work well so that you can see all of us and everyone can give a great smile. And I hope I'll manage to get the right slide on. So if everyone can see my intro slide again, I guess we can start. I'm recording this webinar, so if you don't want to be seen, just don't ask any questions. There's a Q&A section which you can use to ask questions. We have a Q&A team that will be managing most questions. They will try and answer questions in writing, particularly clarification ones, so don't hesitate to just write. And the most moderate already. But now I'd like to introduce you to our agenda for the next 2 hours. It's quite a dense schedule we have ahead of us, and it's pretty challenging to put a large exercise in such a limited amount of time. But we wanted to part of this exciting trajectory, and also we wanted to free you for lunch. So this is the challenge we put ourselves in. We will have a first hour, which will be a more clever scenario, our approach and objectives, and then show you first global results. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of this first hour, and then we will have a second hour where we will have a first session on main assumptions and first results for consumption sector. And the second part of this technical session will show you the results or first results on energy production and carrier balances. And we'll have two Q&A sessions at the end of each such subsession. So without further ado, I would suggest that we start with this first session. It's 10:05, so it is time to start. We start with this first session that is a general introduction session and where we want to show you first global results. And the first subsession is one on the construction and the approach of the scenario. And before I pass the floor to all of us, and this is a graph about EU greenhouse gas emissions since the 40s, and up to 2050. This is an ongoing story of reinforcement of ambition, mobilization of levers. And you can see at the beginning of this story, first climate policies aimed at keeping greenhouse gas levels stable, and they were mostly targeting the supply side. But in the noughties, some of us fought quite hard to slowly win the energy efficiency first principle. And this principle has still been debated in the council and only just won a few weeks ago in the EED negotiations. Now, with action being never enough and the climate emergency getting more and more real, is getting steeper and steeper. We need to do twice the effort that we've done in the past 20 years in the next 20 years. Trajectory that is compatible with the 1.5% effort. a 1.5 degrees effort. We're of course facing also biodiversity crisis being discussed internationally and an unprecedented energy security crisis. This is why in the Clever team, we feel that to live up to that challenge, there's something missing still in this principle. In fact, it is more and more referred to, but on the margins, as an adjustment at the core of the policy. Sorry, I've been distracted by this recording thing. We think that sufficiency should be at the core of energy and climate modeling for Europe. And this is what we'll try to show you today. And we will start, for those of you who are not too clear about what sufficiency means, with Frauke, who will tell you a bit more about sufficiency. Frauke Wiese is an associate professor in the field of energy system transformation at the University of Flensburg. She co-leads an interdisciplinary research group on energy sufficiency, together with Benjamin Best from Wuppertal, and the Öko-Institut is also involved. Frauke, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to give this keynote, as I'm really impressed by the work that has been done by all the colleagues who has been involved in this European scenario process. And I'm particularly impressed by the Negawatt colleagues who has held everything together and has pushed the process. So it's becoming more and more obvious that sufficiency is an important and decisive strategy. Also in the latest IPCC report, sufficiency has been mentioned and described for the first time. It appeared in the IPCC report. And in their definition, it becomes clear that sufficiency is about the two sides of enough. So on the one hand, it is about the enough to fulfill everybody's needs for services to live a decent life. And on the other side, it's about enough in the sense of avoiding overconsumption, adjusting the amount of services to keep the demand impact below planetary limits. And by this definition, it becomes also clear that a fair distribution is also included in this sufficiency definition. Please, next slide. We will only achieve our climate neutrality goals, I'm convinced, and other sustainability goals if we significantly reduce our energy demand. And to achieve this, we need to combine sufficiency and efficiency. And I would like to illustrate that with a small example. So the graph shows 3 indicators for the development of space heating demand in Germany over the last 30 years. And as you can see from the green line, we have made progress in efficiency. So the heat demand per square meter of living space has decreased, but the sufficiency indicator, living space per capita, which is shown in red here, has risen from 35 to 47 square meters of living space per capita. And the total consumption, it's a combination of the two, and this has roughly stayed the same. So to have a chance to achieve the reductions we need, we must combine these two strategies, as it is done in the Clever scenario, but unfortunately not yet in many scenarios I'm aware of. But yeah, of course, sufficiency does not fall from the sky. Just like the more commonly discussed strategies of efficiency and renewables, sufficiency requires concrete policy measures. Sufficiency is not about individuals behaving in a morally correct way. It's not about, it's not only, it might be a part, but it's not mainly about individual decisions, but it's about creating framework conditions that make low energy and low resource choices the more practical ones and the more obvious option. An example, if you ask people in Copenhagen why they cycle so much, very few say because they do it because it's eco-friendly, so only 16%, but the majority states that it's easier and faster. And that's where we need to get for many other choices as well. So, but currently in the vast majority of cases, the political framework points to the opposite direction. So there are barriers for sufficiency in current policy frameworks, and these anti-sufficiency policies, they must be abolished, and sufficiency supporting policy must be at the center of policy strategies, both on consumption and production side. So, and this is also part of what the this clever scenario wants to put a showcase for. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Frauke, for this really interesting and complete presentation. I really like your second graph on the indicators. We've got very similar data for transport, even at the European level. So this is not just a case for buildings, but it's a really good example you took from Germany. So thanks for this. But now we wanted to, in this introduction, tell you a bit more about how we've constructed and how we've set the objectives for this project. So I'm giving the floor to Yves Marignac and Mathilde Gelali to do that. Yves Marignac has been active in energy transition matters for 25 years now, and at Negawatt for 15 plus years. He contributed to the genesis of this project and is acting as a senior advisor on Clever. Mathilde Gelali is an engineer who has launched the technical works around the project. And Mathilde has just come back from maternity. That's why we're so happy to have her back with us today, just 10 days, I think, after her coming back. So thanks to both of you, and just go for it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. And as you said, I was among the few people who initiated this project. So I'm so much delighted to contribute to this presentation today, starting with the vision for Europe. Next slide, Stefan, please. Thank you. The vision for Europe that Clever is about, and this is about sustainability objectives. The overall intention of the project is to build a trajectory that addresses both climate and sustainability issues on one hand, but also energy security and independence and sovereignty on the other hand, and tries to define a trajectory that sets us out of the crisis towards long-term global sustainability, which translates into global long-term objectives. Next slide. Global objectives, first of net zero emissions as soon as possible and within a carbon budget that is compatible with the 1.5 degrees objectives. And second, an objective of relying on 100% local renewable energy in the long term. The project is not only focusing on long-term objectives. We very much care for a safe pathway, which first means safe in the sense of feasible or realistic. So we very much care for the balance between ambition of objective and realism of pace and depth of transformations. But we also mean by safe, safe in the sense of the donut that Frauke just showed us, meaning sustainable in the broad or deep sense, taking into account the systemic merit of all options. And we also mean by safe a fair trajectory, taking into account a meaningful and fair share of efforts and benefits between countries and within each country. And the overall integrated matrix of the UN Sustainable Development Goals seems to us a very relevant compass, both to think and elaborate the trajectory and to assess the results of the scenario. This systemic ambition translates into a systemic approach, which first, when it comes to modeling, is rooted in the so-called SER, or Sufficiency, Efficiency, Renewable framework. And this is why we call it a low energy vision, of course. This means that instead of the traditional way of thinking in terms of resources first, then transformation into energy carriers, which in the end deliver some services with low attention paid on the services themselves. We, on the contrary, start with thinking about the dimension, the design, the priority between services, and that is where sufficiency comes in before we go backwards and think of efficiency regarding all the transformations and losses. And finally, of substitution by renewables for energy resources. So that is a first important part of the modeling. The second part, second principle, which is important to emphasize here, is the bottom-up and physical construct of the model, which allows for us to first really take care about services and think about the evolution of energy services based on dedicated indicators. It also allowed for us to think of the balance between energy carriers, taking into account many different constraints and thinking about resources and uses and infrastructures, taking also care of raw materials issues. And this bottom-up approach and the scope we are covering, including all agriculture, forest and land use issues, allows also to address a very complex issue, which is the biomass nexus. Our scope is also covering, and we think this is important and consistent with our systemic and sustainability approach. Our scope is also covering all sectors, including the maritime transports and non-energy feedstocks. And yeah, all this bottom-up, low energy approach is, we think, key to develop a sufficiency-based strategy, as we will see later on.
Thank you, Yves. Mathilde.
Good morning, everyone. So one of the key features of the Clever scenario was its bottom-up approach. So we started from the national level using existing prospective works of partners were available. But these were very diverse, either in their intention or objectives or the methodologies used, the modelings, but also the parameters and the level of detail. So our first challenge was to make them comparable. So we created the dashboard to translate all this material into a common language and to add also our shared understanding of sufficiency and the adequate indicators. And we also developed an ad hoc model. Then we were ready to compare all these national trajectories in order to meet our second challenge, that was to harmonize this material. And by harmonizing, we mean that we needed to seek common choices to ensure consistency on the trajectory at the European level. And we also, the challenge was also to increase the ambition wherever possible. And through fruitful dialogue, we were enabled to enrich each national trajectory. And this also allowed us to build national trajectories from scratch where no work was available. And then the third challenge was to build a consistent European vision from these national trajectories, but going beyond a simple aggregation of trajectories and questioning, for example, the exchanges between countries and the sharing of efforts. And of course, it couldn't be as sequenced as this simple three steps scheme. So I really want to say that it really was an iterative process throughout the work.
Thank you, Mathilde. Back to Yves.
Yeah, this is just an illustration of one important outcome of this both collaborative and low energy approach, which is the work we've done regarding so-called corridors of consumption. I mean, thinking of energy services levels in the different countries and thinking of the way they could converge within limits that we could set. So we worked with this principle of corridors and harmonization of national trajectories based on key indicators. And you can see on the graph the example of this convergence, corridor and convergence for the passenger traffic in kilometers per capita. So we first discussed a minimum based on decent living standards, and we used a growing scientific literature for that. We also considered some maximum so-called 1.5 degrees compatible services level. And we discussed how the trajectories could converge within those corridors. This was based on a process of bilateral and multilateral dialogue. And we also, of course, included a lot of thinking on the policy proposals at EU, national, and local level that could support such convergence. This process, we think, was important enough to merit some dedicated publications. So we published already 2 notes on the residential sector, which is really based on this consumption corridor approach, and one on the industry, which is more based on production corridors, but taking into account consumption and energy intensity by branch. And we will shortly, in the first quarter of next year, publish another note on convergence corridors for mobility.
Thank you, Yves, and thank you, Mathilde, for all of this. I just want to quickly remind you, we did not do this alone. We've already shown you all the partners network, and we're covering also the whole of Europe, EU27 plus UK, Norway, Switzerland. We did this with around 25 partners of think tanks, universities, are the ones who've worked on a trajectory bottom up, as described by He's worked on energy scenarios for 100% renewable energy, local solutions, and public participation since 1999. He also coordinates Enforcer Europe, a network of NGOs that developed 100% renewable energy scenarios for 10 European countries and for the EU. Gunnar, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And if I could get the next slide, I'll just give just a few words about what we've been doing as an active partner. Of course, we collected information on past development. I mean, this whole, we started in 2015, how is it developed and what was the trends? We had to avoid the COVID-19 anomalies because you couldn't expect that one to go on. It was just in the middle of our work. Then we reviewed national policies and ambitions, and in a country like Denmark, we have a very ambitious policy for the limit of what we can do, but also we included that. And then, of course, we include our own past scenarios. As we heard Stefan mentioned, we have been working on scenarios for 20 years. So we had a number of scenarios to draw on, particularly one from 2015 that we could update. But we also had to include new studies of development with sufficiency. For instance, the Danish Engineers Association had launched a study about how you can make the transport, the personal transport, much more sustainable with sufficiency measures like we define. Then came the dialogue with partners that you heard Mathilde talk about, and then we finalized the dashboard. And now we have the most comprehensive economy-wide description of past and future energy demands, because the dashboard was quite demanding, but also quite detailed. And we don't have other means where we can compare these detailed information internationally. Next slide. I just want to show you, you saw all these nice graphs in the beginning, but this is the actual work we've worked on. This is just a snapshot of one small piece of this large dashboard, which is an Excel sheet with a workbook. Next slide. And how we'll use the clever scenarios. So sufficiency is not really recognized in Denmark's climate policy, and we hope to use this project to change that. And this, in practical, in 2023, we present sustainable ways to make Denmark an EU 100% renewable energy and carbon neutral, using clever in many events. And this is from our 1 hour 2022 events, but we'll have many more of them in 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Gunnar. And now over to Krista. Krista Pettersson is a Latvian geographer who works as an energy expert for the NGO Green Liberty. Her focus is decarbonization and democratization of the power sector. Krista, over to you as a commenting partner.
Thank you and good morning. It's been a great pleasure to be a part of this project. And could you please turn on the next slide, please? Yes, I guess that for us, foremost, this project was a learning experience, but also a way of our own capacity building. So since we did not have much experience with energy scenarios, previously, we actually spent most of the project time tracing, let's say, historical data, understanding different sources and comparing it, let's say, with those perhaps the results that we received from negawatt experts. And and also these assumptions that underlie somehow the national trajectories. It was an important aspect for us to understand how the future trajectories may look like. And I guess that that come from along with this project. And first is that we can now more concretely anticipate the actual transformations that would be required for this low energy vision to come true. And I think on the one hand, it's a major urban change, but also a landscape change as such. And finally, I think that we will definitely use even the first results for constructive dialogues with policymakers, because we have just, let's say, obtained the first formal energy scenarios that will guide the revision of the National Energy and Climate Plan. And then we hope to, say, somehow aim for more ambitious climate goals included in the next version of the plan. So thank you.
Well, thanks to you, Krista, a lot for all the work in the past years, and also to Gunnar and for taking up this challenge of presenting all this work in such a little amount of time. Nevertheless, and you're not responsible for this, we're slightly late, so let's just move on. I can just tell you that all this work has, of course, borne fruits, and we now want to really show you first global results for this clever trajectory. And to do this, I will stop sharing my screen so that Nicolas can share his screen. I can just introduce to you Nicolas. Nicolas is an engineer, and he's been with Negawatt for over 2 years now, and he's been coordinating the modeling. So Nicolas, I can already see your screen. The floor is yours to give us a bit more light into what all these indicators and that Gunnar has shown. How did that turn into global results?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everybody. So we'll present here first global results of the clever scenario. As mentioned by Stefan, these are preliminary results, but should give a good overview of where the scenario should stand. So first of all, it is a scenario that responds to climate emergency, which is compatible with the objective of remaining below 1.5 degrees. How do we define this? We use the carbon budget to say that it is 1.5 compatible. So we defined a carbon budget for Europe, 27 countries. And we fixed a maximum EU budget of 26 to 28 gigaton of CO2. To evaluate this, we considered, first of all, world cumulated CO2 emissions over 2020 to 2050. We used a world budget of 500 to 550 gigaton. This corresponds to budget for 50% chance of remaining below 1.5 as defined by IPCC. And which also corresponds to the median of most ambitious scenarios. World cumulated budget, and we chose a demographic share for Europe, so of 5%. And this gives us a 26 to 28 gigaton CO2 as maximum EU CO2 budget per year. And we also checked that the cumulated methane emissions were coherent with 1.5 trajectories from IPCC. So a scenario which also goes beyond climate change. We tried to limit the use of uncertain assumptions. So we didn't use strong disruption deployment rates of vehicles, of heating systems, of renewables. etc., etc. We didn't integrate uncertain technologies like carbon capture and storage, new nuclear, or with a very low level, we integrated some power to liquids and some carbon capture and use. The last thing of uncertain assumptions is natural sinks contributions. There is room and need to improve natural carbon sinks, but last year's figures show a decrease and calls for precaution on possible improvements and to not rely only on them to reach carbon neutrality. So our hypotheses are close to the 2030 EU LULUCF objectives recently agreed, and we will see that this is enough to reach GHG objectives without the need of carbon capture and storage. The second aspect I wanted to mention here is that we also include deeper sustainability considerations. We integrate sustainable, for example, in comparison to European Commission or JRC evaluations. We include consideration on materials. We followed a very detailed gigawatt flows analysis for France. So we followed the recommendation of this analysis by looking, for example, for lower demand or sound electrification, especially for vehicles. We integrated energy security. The scenario do not need energy imports after 2045. And the last and very important point is also equity in the transition, and it's at the heart of the concept of sufficiency as we implemented it, and it brings convergence on energy services level in Europe. And sufficiency is the key enabler to bring these results. But the curve is steep and action is needed now to reach such ambition. As you can see on this graph of cumulated CO2 emissions from 2020, most of the carbon budget is consumed by 2035. So we must act now if we want to not overshoot 1.5 objectives. So with our scenario, some big results with our scenario, which at least minus 95% about minus 65% by 2030. We are at most at neutrality in 2045. We reach at least 75% of renewables in 2040, more than 90% of electric renewables in 30. In 2030, we are at about 40% to 45%, without including renewable imports. And these figures is under finalization. And the scenario is a 100% renewables scenario. We also see that it is not necessary for each country to reach the previous objectives mentioned. A solidarity among EU countries is possible and probably necessary to reach ambition at the EU level. For example, here we see that it is not necessary for each country to reach 100% renewable electricity on national territory. Here on the map, for example, in green, we have countries which export electricity. In orange, we have countries that import electricity, and in gray, the ones which are rather at the equilibrium. And we also see similar results for GHG emissions. And of course, other possible distribution could be further studied. Here are preliminary results, and we are really keen to have feedbacks. On energy savings are key to reach the deep sustainability objectives we mentioned at the beginning. And in this scenario, we reach minus 50% of final energy over 20. Compared to 2020, which corresponds to 15 to 18% in comparison to the REF 2020, which is used for official objectives and should be more understood by some of you who follow the discussions. and last figures in 2040, we're at about minus 45% of demand. Energy savings also a matter of equity, as sufficiency brings a strong convergence on final energy consumptions, which reflects convergence on energy services levels. Here on the graph, you can see the examples of France, Germany, and Poland and Romania, which begin with a very different level. France almost twice higher in final energy consumption than Romania, and they reach quite similar levels in 2050 here in green. So a strong convergence in final energy consumption, reflecting strong energy services levels convergence. But of course, there are remaining differences for various reasons, among them climates, the types of economies, and many, many other ones. And well, sufficiency is the indispensable complement to efficiency in order to reach strong energy reduction. First of all, there is a growing consensus over the possible 50% reduction countries. On the right, we can see a comparison of several scenarios, which include energy savings and sufficiency, and which show which arrive at about 50% reduction. And yes, all these scenarios include sufficiency. What many people wonder is, what is the role of sufficiency in reaching the 50% reduction? We made a first analysis of national scenarios in UK, France, and Germany. And what we see is that sufficiency would bring 40 to 50% of the reduction seen in this type of scenarios. And as a complement, or as the last global result, results on energy security in Europe, which is a very present topic at the moment. So first, maybe to explain what we see in the screen, we have a Sankey diagram, which represent the flows from resources on the left to final energy consumption on the right by demand sector here. And we see that we go in today from about 9,000 terawatt-hours of net imports in Europe, almost 11,000 if we include uranium, to less 50, and could even be reduced if no import was considered as a priority. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Nicolas, for these first insights into our results that will be further detailed later into sectoral results. Now that you know what a Sankey diagram is, I think this will be used by our partners, because they have, just like before, quite short slots to present you very complex results. So thanks to them for playing the game of this. And we start with Johannes from Germany. Johannes is a researcher at Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy in the division Energy, Transport and Climate Policy. He currently works on a PhD project integrating energy sufficiency policies into sectoral demand models. Johannes, your turn.
Thank you, Stefan. Next slide, please. So this short slides connect very much to what already has been said by Gunnar and also Nicolas. This is a snapshot of the scenario that we constructed for the German trajectory in Clever. We did not do proper modeling ourselves, but we have the luxury position in Germany that we have many scenarios out there, and some of them also including sufficiency matters. So we extracted all these detailed data where you saw the snapshot of the dashboard in the UBA rescue study in Germany. There we extracted data for buildings and industry, and for the transport sector, we used mainly the Agora Energiewende study. And then we did some adjustments to the sufficiency related indicators, and also in the harmonization process with other European scenarios, we strengthened this. Next slide, please. So here you see, oh no, please go to the next one. Just leave that out. This is the Sankey diagram for Germany, for the German trajectory. So here you see the year of 2020 today. Here we have a situation for Germany where we import about 2/3, 3/4 of all energy consumed. And we go, next slide, please, to a system totally transformed, already shown by Nicolas for Europe. This is the German slide, to a system where we have almost no energy imports. And this is really something very new because all other German transition scenarios still rely very much on imports. That's one of the key differences that we find here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johannes. This is probably exciting for quite a few people. So we'll get the detailed results at some point, but we wanted to just give you a quick highlight. And this is also what Andrea will do. Andrea Roscetti is a researcher at the Politecnico di Milano for end-use efficiency and for the research group. And he's also a board member of
Thank you for the work carried so far from all the group. First of all, something to say about the work on the scenario. It's really hard for us since we have no trajectory yet at Italian level. The collection of data was quite difficult since the statistics are quite poor at national level. As you can see here, one of the key points is the consumption reduction in the long term. We are even below what was forecasted by one of the few scenarios, the Greenpeace one, and really below the national ministry trajectory for the moment. In the next slide, you can see the Sankey diagram for 2020. What is really important is to highlight again the import and the actual situation that we know it's quite difficult for 2030. The next slide, we can see first transition towards less import, more local production, mainly made by more renewables, adding some renewables and starting reducing the consumption too, because it's really a key point for the next slide that is the final trajectory. I would say that the target is this, so reducing a lot the consumption will lead us to reduce impressively the imports that are still there. The target zero is generation slightly above the intention of 200 terawatts for photovoltaic and wind production. So that's something really important for us to reduce in order to reduce also imports. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I think you were even shorter, so congratulations for that. And thanks for all the work to you too. What about Poland? And for Poland, originally it was supposed to be Anna Lawiczowska, but she had to rush to a last-minute, urgent, important meeting in the finance ministry. So it's Krzysztof Kubilka who's replacing her. He's an engineer who's worked on energy in research centers and in the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment. At WISE Europa, he focuses on projects related to climate policy, energy transformation, and industry decarbonization.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Also happy to be here. And since everyone was a little bit shorter, I can be longer, I guess. So, yeah, you probably all know that Poland is in quite difficult position because of the high carbon intensity. We are mainly based in electricity generation and individual and district heating in coal. And on top of that, we also our ambitions and the pace of the transformation was quite slow until now. At the same time, having other issues in our energy systems, such as low capacity reserves, and obviously the shortages of fuels because of the war. Can I have the next slide? But that doesn't a lot of potential to unlast. We recently seen the spectacular increase in prosumer PV panels, and there are legislative barriers that can be easily eliminated for deployment of onshore wind, but also other technologies. We have already policies and measures targeted in energy efficiency, the renovation of the buildings, but we need to scale it up. But most importantly, I think there was a mental shift in the approach to the transition in Poland. Before, we were not so ambitious in terms of the climate, but the war changed this mindset, and we know now that the reducing the fossil fuels means the deployment of the renewable energy efficiency measures, and so on. Can I have a first slide? Yeah, so you could see the Sankey charts that show the pathway made by the clever scenario. So we know that phasing out coal electricity generation to 2035 is doable, and clever scenario and other institutions confirm it. But to do that, we need to get more ambitions in renewable deployment. At the same time, protecting the vulnerable groups. I think that on top of that, I didn't make the justice to the sufficiency measures and the energy efficiency measures that are crucial to for Poland to reach the decarbonized economy. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Christoph, and thanks to the three of you for sticking to the challenge. I think we're a little bit late, but not so much. So I'll be very, very brief with this very last slide of this session, where I just wanted to come back to what we take out, what we can already take out, and we want to define this a little bit better next year, also thanks to the dialogue with you now. But we think that to set Europe on a sustainable and secure 1.5 pathways, those are the levels which Europe should set itself towards 2040. And I won't repeat them. We also think that the next, well, what is really important next, please, is energy demand, energy savings, and sufficiency as the indispensable complement to efficiency. Finally, what we would like to see coming from the European institutions and policy flow is that the Council adopt the European Parliament 2030 targets of 14.5% minus in the EED, below the reference scenarios, and the binding character of primary energy, which is so important efficiency. In terms of renewables, we would also support the 45% target supported by the Parliament. It's are important in place to keep this now, and at sectoral by from Christoph, we will sector it next. Something to bear will plenty be because we lack beyond strategy most states. And finally, I will take a look at the questions quickly. We're at 5 minute time. That's okay. We can probably take 12 minutes for a few questions. Maybe one question, quite a few questions open. Maybe one question for Yves. How compatible are efficiency, sufficiency assumptions with respects to GDP growth assumptions? What are your assumptions in terms of GDP growth? A question by Manuel Villavicencio.
Yeah, thank you for this very important question. I mean, the main or blunt answer is that we don't take GDP issue into account in our modeling. That doesn't mean, of course, that we don't care for economic soundness. That is mostly based on the idea that, well, first, GDP is not a very good indicator when it comes to building a new economy that is compatible with planetary boundaries. I mean, unlimited growth does not fit with limited resources. But more precisely, we started with this approach long ago with Negawatt in France. We think that building models and building scenarios while embedding don't put us on the right pathway. So we take another approach, which is to think of a sound, physically relevant trajectory, and then question the economics that can come with it. And our findings, especially again in the French context, but that applies to the European one, are that I mean, efficiency and sufficiency, when implemented in the view of this donut economy and reasoning, are actually a way to create value by saving resources instead of destroying them, and that there is a sound and positive economic pathway based on this approach. We don't have any results on the European level to confirm that, but we have some in different countries. And again, in France, for instance, the assessment of sufficiency-based scenarios by Negawatt, but also by ADEME, for instance, the French Energy Agency, confirmed that these scenarios are positive, even from a GDP perspective, but more concretely that they create a lot of jobs, for instance. So we should not oppose sufficiency and of GDP through this sufficiency vision.
Thanks for that, Yves. I can also just say that we're in touch with French think tank Institut Rousseau, who are planning to prepare a big study for Europe, which they did for France, which is called 2% for 2 degrees. And we'll look at really financial investments related to the transition. And they will, as much as possible, try to use our data, possibly compared with others. So we will have an idea of what clever means in economic terms, probably at the end of next year, if all goes well. Maybe I take a second question for Nicolas. There's a question about Germany. It could also be for Johannes. Well, you see, the near zero energy imports are for extra EU trades or all encompassive? Also, is it net trade or just imports? E.g., power exchanges with other EU countries such as France, the Nordics should increase in a net zero world. Nicolas?
Several questions at the same time. Yeah, the almost zero imports is true for yeah, European Union and also for EU 30. And can you precise the second question for Germany?
The second question, is it just net trade or just imports? And power exchanges with other countries such as France, the Nordics should increase in a
Oh, we talk about net imports, so we don't position ourselves in the fact is should there be trade or not. We just say that the imports are not necessary. So we talk about net imports for this.
Okay. I also have another question about imports and exports, Nicolas, and about imports and exports of synthetic fuels. Are those balanced among EU countries, or is there import from outside Europe considered for these fuels?
Well, when we say no imports, we took a very broad coverage of the scenario, as we include feedstocks, we include maritime, and all what fed these sectors are produced in Europe in our scenario. So broad coverage and everything from territorial production.
Okay. I'm also seeing a question, which I only just see now, so I'll see how I manage to answer this. It's probably more for me. In 2022, as the effect of the energy crisis, sufficiency became a buzzword in some European countries. In France, the definition of sufficiency used by the government is actually very close to what we traditionally call energy efficiency. beyond the Clever network, do you see different definitions, understanding of sufficiency used by European policy makers? If so, how to address these? I think France is a bit of an well, there are other projects and research projects working on sufficiency, and you can also make a difference between indeed the French, the English term sufficiency, which really has this donut approach of lower and upper level, and the French word sobriété, which mostly implies going down and maybe has less this aspect of decency. We know that in the European Parliament, there are things moving, and I don't know what's the state of the latest discussions in the EPBD negotiations. The Parliament, some parliamentarians had put amendments pro-sufficiency in there, and I don't know how these are going up. I think in terms of definitions, using the IPCC definition like Frauke did could be a nice way to do it. And possibly I would see that making it clear that energy savings, which is the term used also by a lot of NGOs in Europe, have two legs, and that one of these legs is energy efficiency, but the other leg is energy sufficiency, could possibly be a nice way to clarify what sufficiency really means in terms of European policy making. It is, for me, it is the missing leg of energy savings. And energy savings until now is actually energy efficiency in terms of policy making at European level. And that's really what we would like to change and achieve with this piece of work. Another question?
If I may, I just wanted to comment a little further on Thibaut's comment on the French definition of sufficiency. I think on one hand, we have, I mean, our President Macron is actually often talking about sobriété, which is a French word, to speak about thermal retrofitting of buildings, for instance, which is efficiency. So there's still a lot of confusion, but the French government also published a sufficiency plan, I think 2 months ago, which is really dedicated on sufficiency. But the point is that it's more about what we call servicial sufficiency, or sufficiency related to a better use of existing equipments, vehicles, buildings, infrastructures, rather than changes in the design and the size and number of these equipments, infrastructures, and buildings. So it's a good way ahead to clarify the distinction between the different sufficiency leverages and make everyone's more concerned about all these potentials. And as you said, relevant and explicitly dedicated sufficiency levels are identified so that policies could be dedicated to address them.
Thank you.
So it's also part of the work and the message we want to convey with Clever, of course.
Thanks. I see quite a few questions still that are open, but I also see it's 11:00. Maybe we take just one more. And I think we've dealt with this one already. Maybe one for Nicolas. Do you consider the construction of infrastructure required for the net zero transition, renewables, active travel infrastructure, and the associated energy demand emissions? I think the answer could come from rather the French negawatt scenario than ours.
The infrastructure, yeah, there is a massive need for infrastructure, especially renewables. The first one I'm thinking is about train infrastructures, if we want to enable the modal shift, which is required. But then it's also some parts about the limits of our scenario, some aspects that we didn't study. For example, The exchange is required between countries, and the exchange studied this, so it's also not part of our work, but many ones have done it, and we have made a an important literature review to get into the boundaries defined by other studies.
But we did not take these into the modeling. I think this is more what was done for France, where we really also we did a complete materials modeling. A lot of people like Adrien could tell you a lot about it. It's very complex. For those who speak French, it's on the negawatt scenario, but for the Clever project, there is no such taking into account of the infrastructures per se in terms of their emissions. I see Gunnar has raised his hand, but then you will be the last one, Gunnar, and we'll see if we can come back to these questions afterwards.
Yeah, just to comment on this with the material use, I mean, I think it's important to say that we did evaluate critical material, and for instance, in the scenario for Denmark, we reduced the number of electric cars from the first version into this one we have now, because of the lack of, there's not enough lithium and cobalt in the world to have everybody having a development similar to the European. We're using electric cars, and rather than we should consume it all in Europe, we decided to take a path with less cars basically, and a more.
Thanks, Gunnar. And a word about this in the end, we will do a detailed analysis just for this batteries issue at the end, and maybe some of the colleagues may want to point towards this in the next session. But it's 11:03. I think we should move. We'll see if we manage to deal with the questions later. We will definitely try, or in writing or whatever. I had seen a question about policy, but I wasn't too clear what it meant, so I've left it. I'll see if I manage to think about it in writing. But I think it's time to move on to the technical session, because all these detailed global results, well, they don't mean so much if you don't exactly know how we got to this. And the reality, as I said, of the sectoral transformation is what counts the most. So this is probably the most exciting and technical part, well, at least for those of you who are on the technical side of this session, and I don't want to lose more time. I just hope everyone in an hour's time will come out a bit more clever, or at least I will, because this is a bit more technical, this session. So we start again, I think, with Nicolas, who will also give you, after a quick introduction on the consumption sectors, which is the first sub-session. He will give you an introduction. He will also give you the results for the residential sectors. And as you can see, we're following here the SER, so the modeling process that we've done, where we try to define production or how to match the supply. So we start with demand first, with the consumption sectors, and Nicolas, you start.
Yes. So first, just a quick reminder that three sectors are more or less with equal importance in GHG emissions and in energy consumption. So transports, buildings, industry, also agriculture, which is important for GHG emissions. It is of course included in our scenario, but less detailed and more through a top-down approach. So we will not detail it much today, and we will focus on transports, industry, and buildings today. As mentioned before in global results presentation, energy consumption reduction is essential for several issues. The scenario reaches about 50% final energy reduction. Here we see the contribution of each sectors for this reduction over 2019 to 2050. And we see that industry, the residential sector, and passenger transports brings the higher energy reduction. So we will focus on residential, passenger transport, and industry in the following section. And we will have a few words at the end on freight and tertiary, which are still very important sectors to reach such levels of energy savings. So first, global results. Residential is a very important sector. As we've seen, it brings the higher energy reduction. It is very important because it brings a lot of the energy demand reduction. Sufficiency is key. It brings about 30 to 50% of the reduction in the residential sector. Most of the reduction is related to space heating, thanks to deep renovation. And we also think that a focus should be carried on specific electricity. By specific electricity, we mean lighting appliances mainly. As specific electricity takes a growing share even in our scenario, which includes sufficiency and efficiency. So it could be even more in other scenarios. Which assumptions to reach such ambition? Here, some of the most important ones, not all of them. Deep renovation is the key and needs to start now because in order to have a stock of efficient buildings in 2050, an annual rate of deep renovation of at least 2% should be reached in each country by 2025. And if we need to reach this, we must begin really quickly. Sufficiency is the complement to efficiency. Sufficiency can bring in the short term important 19 degrees could bring quickly 19 terawatt-hours of reduction if only 30 to 40% of households apply it. Actions on hot water, like water flow limiters or installation of networks, can also be implemented in the short term and bring non-neglectable benefits. Then the important aspects is that short-term measures must be converted to long-term effects. And other structural measures must be implemented today to have effects in the long term. As for example, limiting floor area increase, as I will detail it later, or on specific electricity where sufficiency is indispensable in addition of the generalization of efficient appliances if we want to avoid strong rebound effects. The last aspects of residential, I wanted to give an example of how we address sufficiency in our modeling. So here an example of floor area. First, it is important to limit the increase of floor area because it proportionally impacts the final energy consumption in space heating and consequently GHG emissions. But also because of deep sustainability, as the more buildings you have, the more buildings you build, the more consumption of cement, the more land artificialization, the more materials right level for a floor area per inhabitant. So from literature review and feedback from national partners, we define a corridor between 32 to 40 square meters per person, which could provide decent living for all and enable to limit environmental impacts. So we defined this corridor and provided it to partners as a guideline for modeling. And this brings a convergence to decent living standards for all while limiting environmental impacts. Here we have the example of, again, France and Germany and Romania and Poland, which reached similar levels in 2050 with very different initial levels. This corridor was a guideline, but we also had some flexibility in these corridors and in the modeling to integrate some national feedbacks, some national considerations to integrate some realism also in this approach. So we asked partners to at least stabilize the square meters per person where it began with very, very high levels.
Thanks a lot, Nicolas. I can see that you almost caught up with time for such a big sector that we've covered with quite some detail. So thanks for sticking to the time. It is a bit frustrating, including for myself, because we've also worked on quite a few policies and policy recommendations to support all this work. But you can find all of this in and the exchange with you in the next year ahead of a publication next year to really have a trajectory which is completely backed by all these policy recommendations. But without further ado, we switch to mobility. And to talk about mobility, we'll have Adrien Toledano. Adrien's an engineer who's been with Negawatt for 2.5 years. He is responsible for the mobility and the industry parts of the Clever scenario. He's also developed expertise into materials and resources modeling. So he could be answering the questions that I can see popping or we've already done on resources. Adrien, the floor is yours on mobility.
Thank you, Stefan, for this kind introduction. Hello, everybody. I'm going to present now the main results for the passenger mobility sector. As a reminder, a few elements of context here. In 2019, passenger mobility represented 21% of the final energy consumption of the European Union and 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's a sector who highly depends on oil imports. And so it's a main sector to decarbonize where sufficiency plays a key role. In the last decades, infrastructures and public action favor car and air traffic. And this is definitely something we want to change in our scenario. In the Clever scenario, the increase of car occupancy with strong assumptions on carpooling, the modal shift to collective and soft transportation, the reduction of the distance traveled that I'm going to detail just after this, and the emergence of small shared electric cars. In order to present our methodology, I'm going to detail now the example on the distance travel. On the graphic, we can see the passenger traffic for several European countries in 2015. We can see a strong disparity among them, and especially for countries like Poland, Romania, compared to France or Italy. Our approach, which is based on the donut economy theory that Frauke presented in the first session, is based on the corridor approach. We define a minimum based on decent living studies, but also low energy demand scenarios like Grubler or the studies of Millwall-Hawkins that Nicolas showed in his slides. We have this lower bound limit of 11,000 passenger kilometer per capita. And then we consider an upper bound limit defined as a 1.5 compatible level of services, here at 15,000 passenger kilometer per capita. With all partners, we made assumptions in order to converge within this corridor by 2050. And we can see the catching up of countries like Poland or Romania. In the Clever scenario, we consider policies and measures to support our realistic and ambitious assumptions. In this slide, I'm going to detail some of them. First, on the very short term, we consider at the national level the reduction of speed limits to 110 km/h in highways. This allows 4% of energy savings on car traffic already by 2023. This represents around 100 TWh, corresponding more or less of 5% of the Russian imports on oil in just 1 year. With regards medium to long-term policies that need to be implemented now in order to have the impacts on the results by 2030 or 2050, we decided here to present the example of on modal shift at the European and national level. Here we consider the ban of intra-European flights when less than 5-hour train alternative exists. What is interesting here is that the European Commission already validated for France this policy when a train alternative less than 2.5 hours exists. Of course, in order to allow modal shift, we need to boost the development of train infrastructures, but also consider other levies like the financial incentives or taxation to promote rail rather than air. On this last slide on mobility, I'm going to present the main results at the European level. On the graphic on the left, we can see the total passenger traffic in the European Union in 2019 and 2050. We can see a decrease of the passenger traffic, a drop of air and road mobility, while we have an increase of rail and soft transportation, which has also other co-benefits such as on health, for example. Sufficiency assumptions like the reduction of passenger traffic, mobile shift, the increase of carpooling, where we converge to around 2 persons per car in average in 2050, and the energy efficiency with the emergence of these small shared electric cars, we achieve a reduction of 77% of the final energy consumption of the mobility sector at the European Union. On this graphic on the center, we can see the high share of the electricity carrier by 2050. So the key lessons of the clever scenario on mobility are that first, sufficiency, it's a no regret option, as other levers like electrification cannot be enough. Second, modal shift is key, and in particular, the sharp drop in air travel, coupled with an increase in rail. And third is that the emergence of a fleet of small shared electric cars, together with carpooling, are key to achieve deep sustainability in order to limit other environmental impacts, such as the extraction and refinery of critical raw materials. It is the case of lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, all these critical raw materials that are required for the lithium-ion batteries of electric cars.
Thanks a lot, Adrien, for this interesting, great insight into this other big subject. And as we've pointed at, we will be publishing a detailed note with all these indicators, I mean, many more actually, and many more policy recommendations. These were just examples. We're still finalizing this. But we have, I think, quite a bit to say about the transport section. But there were also quite a few industry questions I saw. I don't know if they were answered in writing, but I'm sure those who asked them will be interested to hear how we worked on industry. So your turn again, Adrien. You're also our industry expert.
Thank you, Stefan. I'm going indeed to present now the main results for industry. A few elements of context and approach here as a reminder. In 2019, the European industry represented 23% of the final energy consumption and 31% of the greenhouse gas emissions. It's a sector who pretty much depends on fossil gas imports. 4 sectors represent more than 55% of the industry final energy consumption and most of the greenhouse gas emissions: steel, cement, chemicals, and pulp and paper. And this is why we made a special focus on these 4 sectors in our scenario. Our approach integrates corridors, which are based on other European or national scenarios. And they ensure consistency with other sectors, like residential or transport, which creates the demand for the industry sector. All these corridors and our approach is pretty much detailed in our note that is already available on our website. In order to present you our methodology, I'm going to detail here the example of steel. For almost all subsectors of all industrial sectors, we consider 3 main assumptions. First, sufficiency, that we define here as the reduction in demand linked to the decrease of new constructions or automobile production, which are the main sectors who create the demand for the steel industry. Second, circularity, which is key as it allows a strong decrease of the energy intensity. In this case, we consider the increase in the share of recycled steel via the electric arc furnace route. And third, energy efficiency, where we extend to all Europe the best available techniques, and also the technological substitution. The conversion of primary steel production, which today is fossil-based, via the blast furnace basic oxygen furnace route to hydrogen direct reduction of iron. On the graphic on the left, we can see the steel production for several European countries in 2015 and 2050. We can see that steel production decreases for all countries between 15 and 25%. Moreover, we can see the strong increase of the electric arc furnace route, where we use 100% of scraps. And this is also the case for countries like Germany, France, or Belgium, for which in 2015, the primary route via blast furnaces is the majority. And in 2050, the electric arc furnace routes is the representing majority. We can also see in this graph that for all primary steel producers, in 2050, we only consider the hydrogen direct reduction of iron root. On the graphic on the right, we can see the contribution of levers to the final energy consumption of the European Union steel sector. And we can see that sufficiency and circularity, together with energy and efficiency and this conversion to hydrogen steel, allows to divide by 2 the final energy consumption of this sector. On this last slide on industry, I'm going to present the main results. On the graphic on the left, we can see European Union industry final energy consumption by energy carrier. Here we exclude feedstock. On this graphic, we can see the reduction of 34% of this final energy consumption. Sufficiency and circularity represents between 50 and 80% of this reduction in countries like Germany, France, or the United Kingdom. On this graphic, we can see that there is no more coal or oil products as an energy carrier in 2050. And actually, this is something that we already considered in our scenario by 2040. Moreover, we can see here a strong increase of the electricity as an energy carrier. And this is pretty much linked to direct electrification. We consider heat pumps for low to medium temperature. We also consider some electric boilers. And we consider also electricity for high temperatures, like the electric arc furnace technology that I presented just before with the steel example. On this graphic on the center, we can see the European Union industry greenhouse gas emissions for 2019 and 2050. We can see that there is no more fuel combustion and electricity or heat emissions in 2050 as all energy carriers are decarbonized. We also have a division than more by than 3 of the industrial process emissions related to cement or some chemical industries. So we have a drop of industrial greenhouse gas emissions. The key lessons of the clever scenario on industry are that first, sufficiency and circularity are essential levers, and they allow to do not rely on CCS. Second, direct electrification is crucial to gain energy efficiency and ensure the balancing of energy carriers. And third is that hydrogen is very relevant for specific applications. It's the case of primary steel production example, steel production that I just explained before, and the production of ammonia and olefins, where hydrogen is used as a feedstock.
Thank you, Adrien. I see that you're done. Thanks a lot for all this, also for the industry sector, and to both of you, Adrien and Nicolas, for also making the effort to cover what we have done, or at least a glimpse into what we've tried to do to address the emergency energy situation right now, and what short-term, what sufficiency can bring really in the short term also. Again, I think you've understood that the mobility note is coming, and if I understand well, the residential and the industry notes were put to you in the chat, so you'll get much more detailed about this. Nicolas will quickly tell you what we've done for the other sectors, or at least some of the other sectors, and then we can go to questions. Nicolas.
Do you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just a few words on tertiary and flights, which are, of course, very important to reach ambition and must not be neglected. So here are a few words, but they are quite similar to sectors detailed previously. For tertiary, the main levers are similar to residential. Deep renovation is the key, and sufficiency is the complement, for example, with floor area convergence or specific electricity temperature regulation as very short examples. And for freight, the main levers are quite similar to mobility. Demand must be controlled and is related to sufficiency in industry. We assume a strong model shift to rail, and of course vehicle renewal, which brings efficiency and zero emissions vehicles. Other important levers integrated in the modeling, I will not detail them here, but just mention them quickly. They can have strong importance in the results. The load factor optimization of trucks and the light commercial vehicles evolution. That's me for just quick insights on this today.
With my microphone, so I hope you still hear me well. Yeah, I also can just tell you, Nicolas pointed to it at the introduction, that we've of course also covered the agriculture sector, but because we've done this rather top-down, we're not showing it to you now. We will also be publishing the data or the main assumptions on AFOLUB in general, so agriculture, forestry, land use, beginning of next year, so ahead of publication. But we're a little bit behind time, so let's go into questions. And possibly I could take one question about the 5-hour train alternative. Less than 5-hour train alternative. Why not be more ambitious on that assumption? I think it's really a matter of political acceptability. We think we have policies that are quite bold. We know we have the European citizens with us. In every poll, you see that they want short-haul flights bans. All the citizens' assemblies in Europe call for very much ambition. But I think the problem is that the people who do the policies are the ones who fly the most, or the ones who travel the most. So in terms of political, and of course, in terms of political acceptability, we need to go little by little, we feel. And also this is for us a measure we should get there by 2030. It's a measure to support our trajectory. This does not mean it's the end game. It's a set of policies we want to put forward. So as Adrien pointed towards, this goes along with taxation policies, a lot of policies which will make people slowly shift to trains. But in terms of developing rail infrastructure, this is a big challenge and will take quite a bit of time. Developing night train is not going fast enough. I'm very happy to take a bit more time in the coming months to see whether we could go beyond this towards 2040, 2050, beyond this 5 hours, while the mindset changes. Because what we've not done yet with the scenario is this whole well, we've done it, of course, and we've shown it to you, but we want to think through a bit more the narrative side. How do we change narrative so that people finally or slowly start to be able to work on a train for a whole day, or to be able, also you need the infrastructure to this, to just be able to take a bit more time to what they do. But this has to do with societal changes which really go beyond the webinar of today and this technical results session. Maybe another transport question for Adrien. Are modal shift and total traffic evolution assumptions or results? Could elaborate on the methodology behind it?
Yes, so maybe I can explain a little bit more the methodology. As you've seen in the slide, we define a level of passenger traffic per capita. Then we made the evolution of this passenger traffic, of this total passenger traffic, depending on the evolution of the population evolution assumptions. And then we define other corridors, for example, on a modal shift, soft mobility, etc. And so, for example, we have a corridor and we have a convergence at about 10% for soft mobility. Of course, it depends on the historical trend on soft mobility and on the national context. For example, cycling in Sweden in winter is not the same than here in France, for example. So we have those adjustments depending on national specificities. And we also define a percentage of collective transportation. We have a pretty open corridor between 20 to 35% of collective transportation in the total passenger traffic. So once again, it depends on the national context, but we also have this convergence. I don't know if I can give a few other elements if you want, but it's a precise answer.
Maybe if you have just a few other elements, don't, yeah.
Yes, for example, on car occupancy, here we have a convergence to 1.9 persons per capita in all countries. We almost reach 2 persons. And this is a key sufficiency measure that is not that much present in other energy transition scenarios. And this strongly allows to achieve this deep sustainability because we reduce the number of cars that we need to answer to these energy savers, but also we allow to reduce the final energy consumption related to car. We also made other assumptions on the decrease on air that I presented, and of course the reduction of the distance traveled that I presented before.
All right. I am conscious of time, and I must admit that I didn't have time to look at all the questions. Maybe we go into the last session and we see if we can take the last questions in the last Q&A session, so that we still try to stick to the schedule for everyone. And then we'll see whether we need more time to manage answering questions at the end of the webinar. So thanks for this, Adrien. And I will take a look at the questions while Nicolas goes into the session, and we'll see if we can take a bit more time for this. So as you've understood, or as I guess all of you now know quite well, we have defined consumption levels. This is how we did the modeling. And the last step for the scenario in terms of modeling was to try and look into how to matching this demand with supply, or supply with demand. And what are the choices we made to get the most efficient and sustainable career balances in line with all these aspects of deep sustainability and systemic approach that we've introduced in the introduction slot. So Nicolas, you have the floor again for this last subsession.
Thank you. So I will give you an overview of the approach we took to ensure an optimized career distribution, and it will be more or less the organization of this section of the presentation. So how did we work? First, we estimate the careers availability, the renewables potentials. So we evaluated sustainable bioenergies potentials. And we made first estimation of electric renewables and first estimations of minimum hydrogen needs to support a 100% renewable system. In parallel, we modeled energy needs as detailed in the previous section, and we defined sectors considering various aspects. Once we have careers availability, careers of consumption, we realize the supply-demand matching, prioritizing most critical sectors like aviation and most critical resources like liquid career. And then finally, we have iterations to adapt careers in final energy consumption, electric renewables, and career transformation like power-to-X. So first, if we go more in detail for each step here for bioenergy's sustainable potentials, we used a rather top-down evaluation made by Solagro, a French associative company who realizes, among many things, scenarios for land use, agriculture, and bioenergies. So in our evaluation, liquid biomass production remains rather stable. Biomass from forest woods remains also rather stable in Europe. What increases is biogas, which increases quite a lot, mainly thanks to the development of cover crops and crops residues, so no dedicated arable lands for additional biogas. And we could also say that the upscaling in our scenario is in line with the EU objectives for 2030. And there is also some increase in what we call other solid biomass, mainly byproducts like wood waste or straw, for example. We compared our evaluation with many different scenarios and assessments of renewable potentials for bioenergies. Not all are shown here. We focused here on JRC and European Commission evaluations. What we see that we are consistent with some of the lowest sustainable potential of bioenergies identified in the literature. Here, the JRC low evaluation. But some supply scenarios reach levels much below, mainly either because they have no GHG reduction targets, because they have explicit objective to reduce bioenergy, like in the 1.5 low bioenergy, or extremely drastic land availability assumptions. So a clever pathway on bioenergies is realistic and could even be considered a bit conservative on bioenergy production. In parallel of the evaluation of renewable energy, we evaluated possibilities of carriers share in demand. So first we collected and analyzed existing scenarios at national and at EU level, and then technical dialogue with our partners to define corridors for carriers share in sectors or uses. The technical dialogue took place based on different criteria which were important. Of course, first the sectorial constraints. If I can mention just one, for example, industrial processes are not all adapted to all carriers, so there are some limited possibilities for some industrial processes, or at least limited possibilities in the short term. We took into account materials concerns. As mentioned before, we used the detailed materials flows modeling for France, and we extracted some guidelines to limit the impact of materials, for example, on lithium for heavy vehicles. And we also tried to integrate other aspects like what is the most competitive technologies, what technologies are already ready enough to be implemented by 2050 at large scale, etc., etc. And finally, we had a final discussion after the demand supply matching to take the final decision. So what is done in the supply demand matching? So here to have this matching by carrier, we first prioritize. Here are figures for 2050. So the first one is on liquid fuels. There are a few biofuels and few credible alternatives for aviation other than liquid fuels. So biofuels go almost all for aviation. Water flight was the second critical sector with a few mature alternatives which exist. So we decided to feed it with e-fuels and e-gas, and this technology was limited to water flight as the technology readiness level. There are some uncertainties on technology readiness level and on carbon sources, for example. So moderate levels for this. The second critical resource is gas, so it is prioritized in uses where it is considered indispensable and with respect to sustainable gas production. So first, water freight and tractors in agricultures. And then it's also used in our scenario for industry, for road freight, and for flexible electric production. So that's for the uses of liquid fuels and gaseous fuels. And on the production side, most of it comes from bioenergies, and as mentioned before, a little share from electricity through power to X, and reserved to water freight. Then, biomass, which we prioritized for uses where they are the most relevant. And only for these ones, as they are limited, biomass is limited by sustainable potentials, and hydrogen is limited because of poor overall efficiency compared to electricity, for example. So biomass was reserved to some industries, to heating in buildings, and to district heating when necessary in complement to other renewable sources. Hydrogen is used in industry, mainly for steel, in feedstocks, mainly for olefins, and also for ammonia, and also for production of flexible electricity in complement to gas, and also in transports, but we limited it only where few other alternatives are available. And the last step of this simplified supply-demand matching presentation is electricity, which is used to complement the mix, but with respect to sectoral constraints and deep sustainability consideration, as defined before. And of course, it's a simplified. I presented in a simplified way. There were many iterations over this process. So where does this approach lead us in terms of results? On electric renewables, by 2030, we get close to the REPower EU objectives for wind and solar. And in 2050, on wind, we are a little below, for example, the European Commission 1.5 tech and 1.5 life. And on solar, we are about 30% higher, but solar is evolving really quickly. For example, the 2030 objectives was almost doubled between the 1.5 tech elaboration in 2018 and the REPower EU objectives for 2030. The second results I wanted to mention here is hydrogen consumption. I precise consumption, not production. Our approach leads us today to about 100 terawatt-hours of consumption in 2030 and about 900 terawatt-hours in 2050. But as mentioned before, the energy section is really the one which is the most likely to have some adaptation in the coming months. But that's the global results. And finally, I wanted to give you some additional results which might be interesting. So first, as mentioned many ways before, no energy imports necessary after 2045. And the second result is on electrification. As many scenarios, we have a significant increase of electricity in the European Union. We have plus 25% of electric consumption and up to plus 90% in some countries like Netherlands or Romania. The difference between the two ones is related to hydrogen production, if someone are wondering. So a significant increase of electricity, but we think it's a sound increase, which is lower than other 1.5 scenarios, for example, the European Commission ones, for example. And this sound increase is enabled by efficiency and sufficiency, of course, mainly, but also because of the bioenergy's role in our scenario. And we think this sound increase can increase resilience, as it can minimize some grid challenges or materials challenges, for example.
Well, thanks a lot, Nicolas. And we're back in our timing, so that's amazing. So we're almost, well, we're done actually with the presentation of the scenario, but we're not done with answering questions. I can also just comment on what Nicolas just said. Well, maybe my personal comment is if I feel we have something to tell the Commission about their hydrogen assumptions in REPower EU, but maybe we'll do that next year. Again, we've worked on policies also to support what Nicolas has just said, but as this was covered, have a note in preparation. We will integrate this rather in the report, and we will develop this in the technical dialogue with our partners, but also in a policy dialogue with those of you who are interested that we will start next year. Let's see what ministers get with next week as they're discussing all of these speeding up renewables, REPower EU stuff. And we hope we'll be able to bring something into the debate next year in terms of policy recommendations on that front. So I will take a few questions. And one question, which is quite an interesting one, has to do with non-energy demand in the industry sector. How do you consider the non-energy demand in the industry sector? And that could be Adrien, for instance, to produce plastic fertilizers. And that would be Adrien Jacob, whom I haven't introduced to you. Adrien's been behind the scenes of this project, so I'm quite happy to put him up because he's done such an amazing work with our tools Adrien, you want to take this question? Yeah, he's worked with that with Mathilde and then with Nicolas.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Actually, I provided a written answer, but I just wanted the other Adrien to expand on it, because he's the one who worked on the industry sector, and is that we used ratios from Fraunhofer Institute study. But yeah, I wanted just to check if you could say a few words additionally on this topic.
Sorry for that.
No, it's
Adrien,
okay.
the other Adrien. We have many Stefans and many Adrien at the Negawatt.
Yeah, too many.
Yes, as the other Adrien said, we had this global approach based on the Fraunhofer study. The idea here of non-energy demand is to consider hydrogen to produce ammonia. Currently, we use fossil methane to produce this ammonia, and the idea is to use renewable hydrogen. With regards olefins, here we favorize the power to methanol route. So we have power, we produce hydrogen via the electrolysis process, and then we produce methanol, which is, let's say, the key element we need to produce olefins and longer chains. So these are the main processes. And on olefins, this route based on methanol is the majority one, even if we still consider some other olefin production via imports.
Thanks a lot, Adrien. Quite a few questions at the beginning on this that were answered in writing. How did you evaluate the capacity of the power grid to balance on interseasonal, monthly, weekly, and even daily hourly tiding period during the year? If not modeled, what was the analytical process to guarantee grid stability? Nicolas?
Yes, we didn't have the capacity to have a full Howley model modeling of the scenario. But there are many studies who show the possibility of the 100% renewable system. So we didn't think it would be our added values. So what we did is we made a very large review of the 100% renewable systems and the conditions which enabled these systems. And when we had some doubts, we used rather conservative assumptions for our scenario. Based on this literature, we took the higher level of other studies made, mainly at high national level. And we think that with Howley modeling, we could even go a bit further on our assumptions.
Thanks. I see that there are raised hands from Eva, and I need to see who's the other person. Yeah, Eve, start.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Nicolas just said. I mean, I wouldn't say there wouldn't be added value in clever including modeling, but I mean it was just beyond our capacities, and I mean this would be really demanding probably even more detailed modeling that we did for up to now. But as Nicolas said, we thought we don't need it if we can make an analysis showing there are some margins based on existing scenarios, which highlight the feasibility of 100% renewables. And the point I wanted to add from that perspective is that these scenarios also suggest how sufficiency combined with efficiency is a very important way to limit the burden that is put on the electric system. The more you do you implement policies to reduce or constrain the overall level of electric demand, the easier it is to satisfy it based on local renewables and to implement the demand flexibility and storage capacities that you need to make this system work.
Thank you, Yves. I was wondering if I could remain with you, Yves, on a question. Answer any questions relating to buildings and the question of deep renovation, which is so dear to us. And actually, what I hear from Parliament negotiations, and even much worse so in the Council, not doing too well in EU legislation. So we'll have to really step up the policy work on this. Did you do a compared feasibility analysis of deep renovation versus more modest renovation approaches? I mean, this is actually a question to Yves as a French negawatt expert, because we did that in France, but not for the clever scenario. So I don't know if you want to take this, or if you're not our buildings expert, but you're also a spokesperson. So you can
No,
say
I
a word
can.
About this.
I can obviously take it from a French perspective to emphasize that yes, in the French context, Negawatt has run analysis for long term and thought of policies, measures, tools to implement thermal retrofit of building. And we are very much convinced in the French context that it is heavily more relevant to implement deep renovation and do it in one step when possible, rather than go for a more modest or a step-by-step approach when it comes to meeting long-term objectives. This being said, the climate conditions are different, so the requirements on the performance of buildings are different, and the actual performance of the existing buildings is also different depending on policies that have been implemented in the long term since many years. So I mean the actual balance between the benefits of deep retrofit and more modest or step-by-step approaches might be different from one country to the next. I think we came to an agreement within the network of partners that in any case, when some one step is to be preferred, but I mean the balance and the level of what should be called deep retrofit obviously depends on the national context, and we didn't run within the Clever project a kind of comprehensive compared analysis of this balance depending on national.
Thank you, Yves. I had not seen that Gunnar had raised a hand for some time, so Gunnar, you have the floor.
Thank you. It was yes, thank you. It was just to come back to these questions about grid extension and also about already now official scenarios with similar development of renewable energy, and which will be followed by official transition system operators and others analysis about what that means for grid extension. So I think it's not really worthwhile that we spend a lot of time on this, but I think it's worthwhile that we are coming in, and why we think that we are actually, and maybe not as ambitious as some of the most ambitious official renewable scenario. Just when it comes to this hourly matching of demand and supply in electricity, we are planning, from at least the Danish scenario, to make an analysis of that as a second step next year. So it's not as is work in progress. I think we'll also come back to that.
Yeah, thanks, Gunnar, indeed, for this. I don't know, Nicolas, would you like to comment on anything? Or I also see there is a question on grid infrastructure that is related to this.
Yes, I think maybe on grid infrastructure, if it's the same, I think Adrien and Toledano maybe already answered before I was saying to the link with industry, how it is integrated. And otherwise, I agree totally with Gunnar on the answer. And to mention that, yeah, TSOs at the European level and at national level already made some hourly models with much more electrification than us. So.
Yeah, and what we haven't done, I don't know if anyone from them was there, was also to get in touch with NSOE. I mean, of course, they do that work, and we definitely are planning to do this next year and to engage in a discussion around grids, because our national data which feed into the TSO debates and the 10-year network development plans, etc. It's 11:56, so I would think it's time to close. The only question, yeah, we will definitely share the electric balancing review. We won't share it just now because I don't think it's very clean, but we will integrate it in the report, definitely. And I feel the other questions are being dealt with. So I would just tend to just slowly close this. I had a few minutes to just give you the next steps for Clever. So Nicola, if you can show you the next slide, I can just quickly tell you what we're planning after this webinar, apart from a nice Christmas holiday. What we've already done and shown to you is that we have published some sectoral notes. There is also, I don't know if it was shared with you, a sufficiency briefing note that goes much more in detail beyond what I and especially Frauke said at the beginning. That could be very interesting for some of you. The mobility note should come beginning of next year, and so we'll do the assumptions on AFOLUB. And beyond this, we will, of course, finalize the trajectory. What we've said also is that with the finalization of the trajectory, we want to make a critical study on make sure that what the choices we made in terms of carriers in the different sectors, and particularly transport, make sense in terms of fair share of lithium for Europe particularly. We will engage more thoroughly in debates in Brussels and around Europe with policymakers to make sure that everything we have prepared on policy makes sense, is relevant, and is consistent to everything that is happening, which is such an intense and moving debate. Every week things move. We are planning a launch in Brussels in June. We'll see. That could have to do with the energy, Sustainable Energy Week. A final report will, of course, be published by then. And we will also publish detailed scenario results that may be very interesting for all of you also by then. What we're not 100% sure we will be able to do next year is sectoral dissemination and also national dissemination. If you press the next animation, Nicola, what we would like to do there, we could do would be to go much more in depth into presenting or discussing and putting a debate into buildings, into industry, what we've done there. And we would also love to go into some national capitals and do some stuff there. But for that, we're still looking for financing for this project for next year. So I just in supporting us next, please, we would really like to get in touch with you. Apart from this, we, I think, can slowly, if you press next, wish you a nice holiday. There is a Clever website which was shared with you. There is also a hashtag if you want to follow us on social media. You've got our contact there. Fabien did not intervene. Fabien joined us in the summer, and he's a policies and relations officer, so he will also be in charge of making the link with all of you. So get in touch. We even have my phone number there. If you want to give me a call, maybe don't do this during Christmas, but I'm available after that, apart from a little break in Morocco, where I hope I'll see you, Fatiha. And apart from this, thanks to everyone, to all the partners who've presented, to all the Megawatt team that's been behind this for the past years. It's been really great. And yeah, all the ones who weren't able to speak today, and all the partners also who didn't have the chance to speak today. Thanks to all of you. So Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, or maybe Happy New Year is a bad luck. I can say Guten Rutsch auf Deutsch, Buenas Fiestas, Buone Feste, Veselich Świat. That's the only language I don't master, but we don't want to be too Western European, don't we? So all of you, all the best, and see you soon next year for more of this and a bit longer.
Thank you and goodbye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.